Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Orkney International Science Festival. It's lovely to see you here. My name is Erin, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's session. So before we get started, I'd like to just remind you to put your phones onto silent mode, but you don't need to put them away completely because we'll be capturing questions and comments on our online system called Slido. So to do that, simply scan the QR code back here or visit the website. And you can type in your questions throughout the session, and at the end, I'll present them to Elizabeth. But if you'd rather ask your questions here in person, we'll also have a roving mic, and you can do that as well. So our speaker today is Elizabeth Woodcock. Elizabeth is a regenerative gardener, writer, and master composter. She has lived and traveled across Europe, gleaning gardening techniques from permaculture to agroforestry on how to manage water resources. She has training in regenerative farming, forest gardening, and from the RHS. Elizabeth also writes regularly in Frontiers magazine, where she discusses a wide range of topics along the themes of the environment and sustainability. More specifically, she draws attention to the importance of healthy soil, not only for improving garden fertility, but also the larger scale impacts such as biodiversity protection and carbon sequestration. She's currently based in Cumbria, and is a regular at the festival, first talking here 21 years ago. She clearly has a wealth of experience, so we look forward to hearing what she has to say to us today. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Erin, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out at 10 on a Tuesday. I've just started wearing glasses, so I'm going to be doing probably a lot of this. So today, first of all, welcome to the talk, Cracking Concrete, Growing Carrots and Sinking Carbon. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about spaces like this. In a lot of urban areas are concreted over, bricked, paved, have membrane upon them. And I'm going to be talking about why it's really important that we remove all this and let the soil breathe. If anyone went to Jim Wilson-Flett's talk yesterday, there was a slide of a man who, one of the Fletts, who had the Beard Liberation Front club. Well, I kind of feel I need to set up the Soil Liberation Front. So I'm liberating soil from paving and concrete. So this garden that I transformed is quite small. It's smaller than the average garden. It's only 130 square meters, which is about half a tennis court. But first I'm going to talk about why. Why am I so interested in liberating soil? And it's not just me, there's a lot of people doing this now. So first of all, I'm going to read a quote from Dan Ryan, who's the Eden Project learning curator. That's the Eden Project in Cornwall. Soil is the ultimate blend of rock, water, air, the dead and the living. It's a mineral nutrient supplier, water reservoir and climate regulator. It stores over 10 billion tons of carbon. Under our feet live a complex community of mini beasts, microbes, and moles. I like to think of soil as the great unifying force. Without it, it's hard to make sense of many of the planetary boundaries. Indeed, it's hard to make sense of any socio-ecological issue at all. Without soils, how could one begin to have a sensible conversation about rainforests, agriculture, food security, or climate change? So we're faced a lot today with information about climate change, and many people feel powerless. But I would say we can do a lot if we have gardens. This is that garden within 5 months. So you can, and through the work I do, it connects me to the land, and I do have a sense of feeling empowered because I'm acting locally, responsibly, and I'm reconnecting with this land in my care. You become a guardian of your land. And through this, we're creating biodiverse havens. You can see in the slide, the picture below. And we're working with the natural, we are definitely working with the natural world. So out of this, I took over 4 tons of concrete. At one point, there was a jackhammer involved, and I asked a friend to help me because I don't really like jackhammers. And in the last 2 tons, I got a bit tired, so 2 local builders with a flat back lorry came to help me because it was, heavy. And when I first took off the concrete and the membrane, the ground really smelled bad because it had been anaerobic. So healthy soil needs air to breathe. And then in over just 5 months, I had 30 varieties of fruit and vegetables growing. And I'll talk about what I planted, but I pretty much just planted what I had because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And I applied quite a lot of compost. So I'm going to talk more about this process of what I did through the talk. So this is just one garden. But between us, we have over 4,000 square kilometers of gardens. It's apparently approximately 23 million gardens. And in this talk, I'm going to be using quite a lot of numbers and statistics. Has anyone listened to the BBC More or Less program where they go into statistics? So all I can say is I've taken these statistics, I've tried to get viable sources, but kind of whoever you talk to gives slightly different numbers. But on the whole, we can say between us, we have a lot of gardens. We have a lot of ground in our care. If you're thinking, so I was thinking, what do these figures look like? What does over 4,000 kilometers look like? So I took, I was wondered how big is Orkney? And apparently Orkney is 990 square kilometers. So we're talking over 4 times all the Orkneys put together, which is a sizable amount. Oops. So again, this is the same garden, and this is this year. There is a red wall in these pictures. I've told this works. Do you see this red wall here? This is the red wall. This is the steps. We move the steps along. So this red wall is this red wall. So you can see this space is now this space. So sometimes as a gardener, when I see the council out spraying or my neighbours spraying or do something differently, I can get a bit disheartened. And it's really important that we surround ourselves with people who are on the same wavelength while we're giving these messages across. And in a recent email, a friend called Jane Augie from the Bumblebee Trust wrote, "Making a dead space live is so important, and the positives are countless. We can play a part no matter what we have and help with making habitat, providing foraging for insects, growing food, helping with the water and carbon recycling, and most of all, giving something back in return from the ground that has been used for the house, not to mention the health benefits and giving people something to grow and cherish. There's nothing quite like the feeling of achievement when you can grow something to eat or sit and watch with pride with your mug of tea or coffee." So what are the benefits of creating a garden based on regenerative methods? Well, ultimately, you're going to have healthy soil. And remember that quote from the beginning, it's the foundation of all civilizations. And I don't know if anyone went to Karen Johnson's talk about rebuilding soils. When you rebuild a soil, you rebuild a nation. So what is healthy soil? I realized when I first did this talk, I kept referring to healthy soil. And then I was like, well, I haven't actually defined what healthy soil is. It's soil that is alive. It's teeming with life, with bacteria, fungi, algae, protists, and nematodes, and other tiny creatures, ones that you recognize. And when soil is healthy, it's helping the plants fight diseases and pests. It's soil that contains mineral and nutrients to feed the plants. It's soil that holds water. It's got a good structure, and plants are going to fare better in the drought. And in soil like this, plants are going to grow to their maximum potential without any chemicals at all. And from healthy soil, you are going to receive food. But you're going to receive food that's more nutritious than food that's grown without good microbial practices. In this garden that I took all the concrete off and I'm transforming, it's going to take a minimum of 3 to 5 years for this soil to become healthy, to have a lot of teeming life in it. And when that soil does become healthy, this people called David Montgomery and Anne Bickley, they've probably more than 10 years into a journey of transforming their garden. They took on land that was on glacial till, so they literally had to make soil. And he is a geologist and she is a biologist, and they're sending their food away to be analyzed for its nutritional content. So you can see from this side that their kale, this is a picture of my kale, but their studies have shown that their kale grown with good microbial practices has got 2 times as much calcium as zinc and 4 times as much folic acid than the kind of the US reference value. So that's one great reason why to look after your soil. I talked last year with Anna Canning about the microbiome and about the microbiome in the soil and the microbiome in us and why that's incredibly important. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but if you want to listen to that, go to this link, it's online. So as well as having great tasting food, and last year I was literally walking out into my garden, picking my lunch and bringing it back in. And a lot of you are gardeners, you'll know that's a wonderful feeling. But we're also looking after all the other creatures, all the other life that are in our vicinity. Sometimes when I show people these slides, they're like, yeah, bees on flowers. Well, every garden has a bee on a flower. But you need to remember that this was concrete. There were no flowers. There was nothing. So there's no habitat. There's no food. There's nowhere for creatures to go. So in the first year, these were the bees that I noted. I'm not a bumblebee expert. I have a friend who is, and I'm often sending her pictures. But these are the bees that I spotted in the first year. So we've got the red-tailed bumblebee, a buff-tailed bumblebee, a white-tailed bumblebee, solitary bees, and this is another solitary bee called the chocolate mining bee on a variety of flowers. And they're really lovely to watch and listen to. And in the second year, so just this summer, I actually saw a pair of tree bumblebees mating in the garden. It's the first time I've ever seen this in my life. So I tried to have a respectful distance while taking a photograph of them. And it was really interesting to watch their whole mating ritual. And at the end, she shook him off, and he kind of frantically went to feed, and she disappeared. But it got me reading more about tree bumblebees, because I don't know very much about them. They're not actually in Orkney at the moment. They stop kind of at the north of England, but they might get here soon, and they're lovely to have. But the female, she'll feed, she'll go back to her nest, and then when she has enough food, she'll go and hibernate. And she hibernates in the ground in leaf litter of a north-facing garden. So my property, I have a north-facing garden, and I've pretty much been, what am I going to do with that north-facing garden? The previous people who obviously didn't like plants at all, the north-facing garden is kind of this much of white gravel. So I am now just letting all the leaves drop, and I'm getting quite a nice lot of leaf litter, and I put sticks on there. So I'm kind of creating habitat. And this is a honeybee on some mint. I probably had honeybees in the first year, I just couldn't take a picture of them. So it got me reading a little bit about bees. You go off on tangents. So I started to read about bees, and we have over 270 species of bee in the UK. Only 25 of these are bumblebees. We have one honeybee, and these live in hives. They're social. But the rest of our bees are predominantly solitary bees, and the majority of these are actually excavating the ground and living in the ground. So if we're putting down so much concrete and we're paving areas, we're actually taking away habitat of bees. And it's the solitary bees who, particularly our pollinators, they are living close to our gardens, whereas the bumblebees and the honeybees are flying around a lot more. So we really need to look after them. And as we all know, bees are incredibly important for harvesting, for us to have our food. So I found this quite funny cartoon. I thought, while I was talking about bees, we all went mad at one point for bee hotels, that everyone was going to have to put a bee hotel in their garden. But it highlights, why have a bee hotel if you're just cutting your grass and actually you don't have any food for them? So then I got thinking, well, this is going to be about carbon and sinking carbon and carbon in gardens. So I just thought, well, what is the carbon emissions for a lawnmower? And even the Daily Mail, I think a couple of years ago, was kind of, you mow your lawn for 1 hour, and that's the same as driving your car for 100 miles. So this is actually coming from a study in 2001, which is a long time ago. But it's kind of always referred to, this study. I think it's about 40 miles now if you're mowing your lawn for an hour. But petrol-powered equipment is being phased out. And there was a study done to look at what is the perfect time to leave your lawn before cutting, and apparently it's 2.5 weeks. So if you cut your lawn every 2.5 weeks, you're making perfect bee habitat, because flowers are pretty much cut off, but then they come again. And the results of the study said, make sure I just wanted to read it, about being, their results highlight a lazy lawnmower approach to providing bee habitat is perfect, which doesn't sound very scientific, but they did actually use lazy lawn-mowing approach. So back to the garden, what can happen when you transform your garden. So I did put up nest boxes. In the first year, I had no birds. Well, I had birds, but starlings and hedge sparrows, which we have a lot of. This is a picture by a friend of mine called Wendy Kemp. We have blue tits nesting. And things like this, for me, just I'm over the moon with excitement that I've got, because it's showing me that there's enough habitat, there's enough food for creatures to want to come and nest in this garden. And then I was even more excited because a goldfinch pair came. They didn't come to nest. They came to, my garden is quite messy. They came to get sheep's wool, and I have coppiced wood as borders for some of the beds that are hazel, and they were stripping the bark off. So we need nesting materials for creatures as well. And then since I've written this, I had a willow warbler visit the garden. It's a small, kind of greeny bird with a white stripe over its eye. It's very aerodynamic. And not a bird, but I actually have had a hedgehog outside the garden, which in a town where I've never seen a hedgehog before makes me really excited. And they're kind of my positive feedback loops that what I'm doing here is right. So, what do you plant? Well, as I said, I just planted seeds that I had. But all my seeds were of a huge range of plants, and I plant vegetables and flowers together. I don't really have rows, so you can see in here there's kale, sunflowers, poppies, rhubarb, and they're all creating different layers, both above ground and under the ground. And I want the soil covered. I don't want any bare soil, because I'm looking after, as well as talking about what's above the ground, I'm looking after what's under the ground, which I'm going to talk more on. So I've just listed here some things that I have growing. It's just the ones that I couldn't fit any more in, and it's probably too much to read anyway. Trees, they're all really important. They're all really important for food, for habitat, for perches, and as I said, they've all got different root depths. So this is, again, I just wanted to talk about what is to regenerate, because I introduced myself as a regenerative gardener. And if you look at what to regenerate means, it means to change radically and for the better, to restore to original strength or properties. And so I'm using these regenerative methods, and they're literally mimicking nature to restore the natural systems and processes, because nature has this infinite intelligence. But if I was to summarize what these practices are, it would be putting back in what I've taken out and having gratitude with that. So I'm returning the compost after the harvest, and I'm making my own compost, because then I'm closing my loop, my cycle. I'm being responsible for what I'm giving out. I'm going to cover the earth to protect it, and I'm feeding the soil web, and I'm helping maintain the symbiotic relationships between the root and the soil organisms. I'm not using any manufactured or shop-bought chemicals. I'm doing limited digging and soil disturbance, and I'm collecting and replanting my own seeds. And I do talk a lot more about these in detail with that talk last year I did with Anna Canning. So while I was making this talk, I had 2 computers die. I had to go back to use a very old computer, and I was getting so frustrated with technology, I went back to the first technology, which is a pen. So my idea was to do this as a flow diagram, but I did it with a pen and then added emojis on it. It's kind of, what does it mean for me to have a healthy garden? Well, I get a deep sense of well-being from it. Knowing that I'm being responsible, I'm creating composting, I am sinking some carbon, I'm doing my bit, I'm rebuilding the soil microbiology, and I've already showed you what the biodiversity effects of having a healthy garden. So it's only really in the last few decades that science has been able to show us what we've got in soil. And as Karen Johnson said in her talk, there's 99.99% of the microbes who don't actually know what they are. So this slide, again, is just numbers. It's not going to be exact. It's just to illustrate there is a huge amount of life in healthy soil. And these are working together. They're living, they're dying, they're eating, they're being eaten, and they're creating a diverse web, a living web. They're sticking it together. They're spitting out sticky stuff, sticking aggregates together, and they're dragging down organic matter into the soil, and they're recycling nutrients. So this is a healthy soil food web. Around, we've got the soil biota. This is all the life in the soil, from the microscopic ones to the ones we recognize more easily, like the worms, the birds, and the mammals. I'm sorry, my voice keeps going. And I have learned a new word doing this talk. It's called bioturbation, when I'm reading a lot of these soil studies. And that's the disturbance of sedimentary deposits by living organisms. So that's earthworms burrowing. So it's interesting when I read the science studies and then I try and put my language as a gardener onto it. So I'm not going to go much into detail because I'm going to go on to the next slide to talk about what's happening there at the plant roots. So we've got the rhizosphere around the plant roots. And around here we've got these complex relationships, these symbiotic relationships with a plant that is trading with microbes. And this is taken from David Montgomery's book, and he calls this a biological bazaar because there's a trade going on. And this is about 3 to 5 millimeters wide around the root. So the root is pushing it, the plant is photosynthesizing, and of this energy that is made, it's pushing about 40% out of what it makes, up to 40% out of what it makes in carbon-rich exudates to feed the microbes. And we're asking, why does it do that? Well, it's beneficial for the plant. It's giving these out in an exchange for water, nutrients, and whatever the plant needs in terms of growth, nutrition, stress tolerance, and helping get rid of plant pathogens, because soil bacteria produce natural antibiotics to help the plants resist diseases. It's the plant is choosing what it wants and when it wants it. For example, it can give out root exudates to prime the soil for that microbial community to convert nitrogen into plant-available nitrogen, mineralized nitrogen, so the plant can actually use it. And this really intimate relationship is built. And this is why we don't want to disturb the soil too much, because if we're digging, we're disturbing these intimate relationships. And if you see this fungal hyphae, which is bringing nutrients to the roots, that's actually coming inside the plant. The plant is inviting it in, because that fungal hyphae, gosh, my words, that fungal hyphae is stretching out and it's increasing the plant's root system. So these fungi, this is a slide taken from my garden. I put down a lot of deadwood. This is a fungal fan underneath the deadwood, and this is saprophytic fungi. So mycorrhiza, it actually means fungus root, and it's referring to the mutualistic relationship between the fungi and the plant roots. And as I've said, the fungus is assisting the plant by expanding its root surface area, and the plant benefits the fungus by supplying the carbohydrates it needs for growth. This mutualism, where they both benefit. And these fungi are crucial for nutrient, water, and mineral uptake. And about 90% of all land plants depend on the mycorrhizal fungi for minerals like phosphorus. And I found this from the New Scientist. Brainless fungi trade resources with plants like a stock market. And this is referring to the phosphorus. Taking up that phosphorus-carbon exchange. And I really enjoyed this quote, because we often think about the birds and the bees and the flowers. But people know that processes in a leaf are important, but every root below our feet has a huge impact on carbon in the soil. And before I go on to carbon, I just wanted to read from a report from the American Society of Microbiology. It's not just the plant that microbes communicate with, but each other. Inter-kingdom interactions between different members of the rhizobiome, that's all the microbes in the rhizosphere, they're thought to be the key in how the whole system functions. For example, the fungal mycelia, the entire network of the fungal hyphae, not only deliver water to isolated bacteria, but they promote horizontal gene transfer between bacteria and attenuate dangerous slips in soil pH. Protists and nematodes feed on certain populations of bacteria and help shape the overall community by predation. Viruses can aid in the transfer of genes between microbial groups, such as antimicrobial resistance genes. So there's a lot of really interesting information about there. And as I said, it's quite a black box. It's becoming more of a grey box. But as Karen Johnson said, it's very exciting what we're finding out about the soil. And as a gardener, I'm trying to implement best practices, which is what I'm trying to get across in these talks. Because in the past, we have gardened, not really understanding these crucial relationships. We've manicured, cut, dug, sprayed the soil. But soil is more than just a substrate to hold up our plants. These relationships, it's like a superorganism of which we are part of. So as you walk, imagine these fungal networks beneath your feet from healthy soil, and you might think twice about digging and disturbing them, because they are extending your plant networks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon, because plants are a vital part of the carbon process through photosynthesis and what they're putting down into the soil. But soil organic carbon sequestration was defined by Olson in 2010 as the process of transferring CO2 from the atmosphere into the soil through plants, plant residues and other organic solids, which are stored or retained as part of the soil organic matter. And this carbon comes from primarily two sources. So we put on mulches, like autumn leaves, or we cut down plants, or we put on compost. I would call them mulches. Science calls that particulate organic matter. That breaks down easily. It's being decomposed easily. And there's mineral-associated organic matter. That's found deeper down at the root tips, the image I showed you before in the rhizosphere around the root tips. This is the carbon being pushed out as those exudates. And this carbon is bonded as microscopic coatings onto soil particles. And it's mainly in the bodies and byproducts of microorganisms and certain plant compounds. This is stuck to the soil particles. It stays there for a long time. Whereas the mulches that we put on, the particulate organic matter, that's freely available to the microorganisms and it gets broken down faster. So if you're not putting mulch on and imitating leaf fall, or you're not putting compost on, and if you're digging, you're breaking these vital relationships, you're going to have not very much organic matter to feed your soil food web. And when you dig, you're going to be releasing carbon because you're turning the soil. I did training with the RHS 5 years ago. We were still trained then to double dig. I don't know what the RHS are doing in their training now, but hopefully they're not promoting double digging. They were also back then promoting glyphosate. I don't believe they're doing that anymore either. So some scientists have thought, well, if we put exudates in the soil, we're putting carbon into the soil, and it's the microbes, this relationship, this mutualistic relationship. Could we sink more carbon by putting exudate cocktails into the soil? So these are some Harvard scientists who were looking into this, because they said first principles would suggest that the more carbon we push into the soil via exudation, the more carbon is going to accumulate in these mineral-associated organic matter fractions. That's by the root tip, the carbon deeper down. When in fact, this doesn't seem to be the case. In reality, you get more mineral-associated organic matter formation, but you also get more loss of it, and it balances out. You don't actually get more carbon sticking around in the soil, even when you're pushing more in. And the researchers refer to this as the priming effect. The input of new soil carbon prompts the decomposition of old soil carbon. But it's that there's an intimate balance between plant and soil and microbe and carbon exchange. And what's difficult about soil research is you can't do it in a laboratory because of all these interconnections. They're trying, but it's very difficult. And as I've said, what we know about soil is very little. And in The New Scientist, Chris Field from Stanford University in California writes, we're gradually building a picture of one of the biggest black boxes in an ecosystem interaction with climate change. And as I said, we need to, when we use these regenerative methods, we're looking after our soil food web. we're looking after the soil biota and all those organisms. And they almost become my main impetus for gardening. People often say to me, have you done X, Y, Z garden design courses? And I have to remember as a gardener, people do want beautiful gardens, and I have to remember to make them beautiful gardens. But I am really thinking about what's under the ground, because I want to have a healthy garden and create habitat and restore these systems for all life, including myself. So this next slide is me with a dock root. I saw this dock and I wanted to try and get out the dock root to see how long it was. And it was very long. So I've talked about this continuum diverse layered plant cover, and we need plants with different root lengths. And a lot of people, you might be sitting there and going, why is she showing us a picture of a dock? Because lots of people try and get rid of docks. They're weeds, and we don't like them. And again, Anna Canning and I did a talk called The Wealth of Weeds, really looking at why they're so important in our gardens. And I think they featured in Chelsea this year, and there's this big debate going on about what can we have in our gardens and what can't we have. And I would say if you manage weeds, as in with a dock, it can have over 20,000 seeds. Let it grow. There's over 400 moth species which feed on moth. And I can tell also if I've got a healthy garden by the end of the summer, if my dock is totally ragged and it's got loads of holes in it, something's feeding on it, so I'm supporting life. But I would cut the dock down before it seeds. Other plants with long roots are comfrey. Comfrey roots are fantastic, and that's also great to make composting teas and compost out of. And I also talk about ground cover and green manures. They've got shorter roots, but they cover the garden. They're covering the soil in all seasons. You can get ones that grow through the winter. And this is a picture of Phacelia and clover. We're normally told to cut them down before they flower to put the nutrients back in, but I absolutely love Phacelia. I find it so structural, and bees love it as well. And last year I block planted Phacelia, and my garden was buzzing all the time. This year I haven't block planted. I have different plants, but I'm not sure, I haven't done it scientifically, but I don't notice as many bees. And although I'm quoting all these scientific studies, for me the best way is to do it yourself. So I might get questions after this talk, how do I do this, how do I do that? I would say be brave and experiment. As long as you're using the basic principles that I've talked about, you experiment with what you want to plant and where, and see what works, which is what Dave Goulson says, who's written the Jungle Garden, which is a fantastic book. So you might think you're on your own with this regenerative gardening, but you're not. My daughter had a party recently, and I bought her some chips. And I was actually really surprised to see this on the back of McCain oven chips, that they are actually investing in regenerative agriculture, and they're buying farms to do their own research on, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And apparently, a friend said to me, is it just greenwashing? But then he scanned this QR code, and there's a massive information. They've got a lot of websites about all the research they're doing. So if you're interested in regenerative agriculture, check out McCain oven chips. There's loads of other people doing it, but I was just really pleasantly surprised by this. So I just wanted to mention Karen Johnson's talk, which will be available online. I really recommend, if you're interested in this area, reading her work. Just checking the time. I was going to, it's 22, so I was going to quote from she's basically in this paper, they've put waste on like limestone spoil and placed it under sugarcane and pasture. And they revealed that the soil quality indices, including biodiversity, were similar or superior to the natural soils that were next to these plots of land. And the total carbon stocks in the reconstructed soil under pasture were 2.7 times higher. So there's a lot of research to support putting waste materials, which is putting the minerals back into soil that we've lost through certain practices, is really working. And she's looking at how we can, in the future, educate people and make waste products available to us all, like crushed concrete. And I'm going to show you this slide from NEP, you know, the NEP estate, which has really brought to the front rewilding. Well, we're all familiar with their estate, but this is actually their walled garden. And what they did is they dumped 400 tons of crushed brick and concrete from demolished farm buildings onto the estate. This was a manicured croquet lawn before they did this. They're creating rough 3D surfaces mimicking the humps and hollows found in nature. And these are providing a microclimate for the different communities of plants on the different aspects of the slopes. And this is their images from a 1.5 acre walled garden. So putting crushed waste on is very different than paving your garden. I thought I'd talk about cracking concrete, and I felt like I wanted to do a little bit of research on the concrete industry. And this is a headline that came up. Concrete is worse for the climate than flying, and why aren't more people talking about it? And over the past 20 years, cement manufacturers have quietly doubled their carbon dioxide emissions, highlighting a sector that has received relatively little public scrutiny despite contributing nearly 3 times as much to global warming as the airline industry. That was the first paragraph in this article. Concrete is the most commonly used material in the planet, only after water, but man-made. And it accounts for the 8% of all global carbon emissions. This is all greenhouse gases. And if we're producing 1 kilo of concrete, that releases 0.9 kilos of CO2. So if you're still, thinking about paving your garden, so if I was to decide I really didn't like my garden, I want it to be neat. It's funny, people use the words disrespectful, neglectful, untidy when they see a wildlife garden, but it's a garden that feeds us as well. A wildlife garden isn't just a crazy jungle, although my daughter would disagree with you. I do see the order in it. If you were to relay this, I was trying to do the figures just so we can kind of understand the impact of concreting the space in your care. And this apparently would produce the same amount of emissions as if I drove a car for a year. And I keep going back to the internet and checking this because I'm like, really? That much? But even with the different estimates, this is what I find. And there was a BBC site, a different site from March 2020, says that if I drive 1 kilometer, I'm producing 180 grams of CO2. Which in the year would be nearly 3,000 kgs of CO2 emission. And if I was to concrete a small space, I would be producing just under 2,000 kgs of CO2. So what we do in our individual gardens is huge. And I really hope I've got this across in this talk that isn't very long, and I've rushed on a little bit. And I'm going to end with the words of Satish Kumar. Big rivers emerge from small springs. They spring forth in remote hills. Big ideas to change the world are also born on the edge. Great movements to transform societies do not start from the center. They start in small places and incubate in some unknown sections of society. So, we can be the change, we communicate the change, and we organize the change. And I'm going to end with this cartoon, which I often see on social media, which I really like. Aren't you terrified of what 2023 could be like? Everything is so messed up. I think it'll bring flowers. Yes, why? Because I'm planting flowers, and fruit trees, and canopy trees, and vines, and berries, and shrubs, and nut trees, and ground covers, and mushrooms, and tubers, and perennials, and pollinators, and medicinals, and biofuels. I'm not planting biofuels, but I'm planting flowers, and I'm planting plants. And what this could probably also needs to say is that I'm looking after my soil. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really, really interesting, and you can see that reflected in some of the questions that are coming through. So I'll start off by asking one from online, but if you're here, have a think, and we'll come to you if you raise your hand to share a question. So there's been a couple to do with compost, which you mentioned. So Somebody asked, is it feasible to make 100% of required compost for a small garden by, say, a family of 4?
I was just talking with Eric about this before. It's very hard to make enough compost for your own garden. And most of us are buying in compost. But I would say check where you're buying your compost from. I'm buying mine from a local green waste facility, and I checked out how they're making their compost. You can buy organic composts, but they're quite expensive. Depends how much organic waste they have in their garden, how big is their garden. Have people heard of Charles Dowding on the internet? He's even buying in compost. It's very hard to make all your own compost. You probably need to, as a mulch, you need to put down about 5 centimeters each year to cover your garden. And it is incredible when you watch compost, all that, the processes that are occurring. You know, I sometimes go into I have a green Joanna because I have an urban garden, and I go from days and it's full of like the green waste and the cardboard, and I literally go back the week later and it's just, I'm like, wow, it's gone. It's been eaten. That microbial activity is going really fast. So it's very hard to make all your own compost without buying it in, but check where you're buying from.
Yeah, definitely. And on that as well, following on, someone asked, in the compost that you make, do you plan and manage your recipe quite carefully, or do you just put in kind of everything you can find and see how it turns out?
I'm a busy working parent, and sometimes I do composting talks with people who are maybe retired and who aren't as busy, and they're very specific and they turn their compost every 6 weeks. Composting is a completely natural process. So even if you left a massive heap at the bottom of your garden, which is the village I grew up in, people just had heaps. You have basic rules, so like we say 50-50, so 50 green, 50 brown, which is 50 carbon, 50 nitrogen. So, and you're using your eyes and your senses. If it's too wet, you're putting in more cardboard. If it's too dry, you're putting in more greens. But no, I don't have a recipe. But you can have recipes, and I'm sure there are people who are really into it, and I'm really into it, but I just don't have enough time, and I know the process works if I sometimes just get out of the way and just put the right combination of things together. And if people want to know more about composting, Garden Organic is who I'm a master composter with, are absolutely fantastic, and there's lots of local schemes where a master composter can come to community groups to teach you or explain more about composting.
Great, yeah, that makes sense. And as you've said throughout, it's kind of about experimentation and see what works in your garden.
And I think that's so important. Get hands-on and don't be afraid. I once went to Jake's Midnight Science Club. I don't know if anyone went to that this year. I went in 2019, and he was just so wonderful to talk to, because he said, what is science? Science is noticing, it's observing, it's having a curious mind. And they are really the first principles of gardening as well. We're responding to, we're sniffing things, including compost. And so get your hands on. But you can have some guidelines. As I said, with compost, you can have too wet, too dry. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Do we have any questions in the audience that anybody would like to ask?
Hello. I just wanted to ask, what's your opinion on like native species compared to just whatever in the garden?
You mean plants?
Yeah.
So, do you know Dave Goulson, his book, The Jungle Garden? Have you read that? I'd really recommend you read that. He does a really big chapter on it. He would say plants, I think he says in one part, a butterfly in Australia that feeds on that flower. If you have that flower in your garden, your butterfly is going to feed on it. And there hasn't been any scientific studies done to say one is better than the other. If you can have natives, it's probably better, because our local wildlife is designed, it's evolved with these plants. But there isn't any studies done to say, I would imagine if you had a whole garden of ornamentals, or depends what you choose, a lot of double-headed varieties, a lot of plants have been bred so much that they're no longer useful to pollinators or local creatures. Personally, I only try to have native species in my garden, but I know from the studies that I've there isn't any scientific evidence out there that it's worse than, but yeah, the native species have evolved with the native plants. And I'm sorry, also experiment. That's another thing. You could plant a section of the garden with just ornamentals and a section with natives. In saying that, I just want natives, but that's just... Hi, Ken.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Just when you took the concrete up and you exposed that very poor dirt, the soil, with hardly any life in it at all, and it smelt terrible, and it just was in a very bad way, how did you bring that back before you started planting?
So that was before I'd read a lot about putting waste into gardens. So I took all the concrete off, and I actually got, the top of a barbecue, you can get those covers that are meshes. So I had this, it's like a bowl shape, it's a massive sieve. So I was actually sieving it because I was like, I don't want any concrete in my garden. I need to restore the land. So I took out all the rubble. There was rubble, tarmac, concrete. I kind of wanted to take all that out. I had to dig in this initial garden because there was even kind of, like curbstones. And it was interesting when I dug down, I felt like I felt like a modern day archaeologist of the last 100 years. I'd dig down a different layer and I'd find someone else's idea of what a beautiful garden was. So I took everything out. I got down to some sandstone foundations of what would have been the outhouse. And I took those out and made the garden with that, made the pond, sorry. I put the soil back and I added compost. I added a layer of compost. And I did a little bit of experimenting. I was on holiday and I got some seaweed. I don't really like I live in the middle of the country. And for me, it's not okay to go to the coast and get seaweed to bring it back because that's not part of my local nutritional source. But I noticed where I put the seaweed was amazing growth, what it had in it. And it's a slow process. We have to remember that. This rebuilding of the soil and the soil microbiota is a slow process. And we're living in a world where we want everything now. And so I have to be patient. So every year I'm going to apply mulches in the autumn. I'm going to collect my own seeds. And I've realized this year I'm not putting a lot of stress on the garden. I'm not taking a lot out of it. I'm leaving a lot of the fruit to go over. I'm leaving a lot of the fruit to fall. Because when I feel like I'm becoming attuned to my land, which sounds very unscientific to say, but I feel I'm attuning to my land and what my land wants. And I think we need to move over into a guardianship, which is a slower process, that we are observing and we're waiting and we're noticing and we're seeing who comes, like goldfinches, and these different birds. So initially I did a lot of work, taking everything out that I didn't want, but actually now that I've read more work, I might have left some of those bits in, the smaller pieces. I would say, adding the compost every year is so important and not using any chemicals. And also leaving all this fabric of life to evolve. I hope I've got through what is happening under our feet. So it's almost now, for me, it's like a hands-off process. After the initial work, it feels quite hands-off. But I'm just remembering to plant planting diversity is really important, and we've even got studies to say the more diverse cover we have, the more carbon we're sinking, because each of those plants is having its own individual process of putting exudates into the soil. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. I've got a question about disturbing the soil, and it's on a bigger scale than a garden. It's imagine like several fields of grass, and I've got plans to plant trees with what is just grass, but this would involve what's called mounding. So your small digger creates lots of little mounds, and then you put the trees in the disturbed soil. And listening to what you're saying about it's good to try not to disturb the soil and not to dig too much. So my question really is, would doing that, the reason I'm doing it is for carbon and biodiversity net gain, because I think just having grass fields is not much value. But in doing it, would I be irreparably destroying the soil, or would it recover in a few years? Or is there something that could be done to help that recovery process, to help the soil sort of recover quickly?
And the land you said is pasture. Do you know the history of the land?
I think it's been mainly used for sheep grazing.
Has it had any chemicals on it, or is it organic?
I don't know. I mean, the last 2 years it's just been left with no livestock, and it's been mown once a year at the end of August.
And is the grass, is it a monoculture grass, or are there many different, is it like a meadow, or is it?
There's clover and pig nut and
nice.
a few orchids in a few places. It's predominantly grass, but there are other species that crop up here and there.
So, and how many trees are you planting? Sorry.
Well, it's about 5 hectares, and it would be maybe 7,000 trees.
Wow, fantastic.
Which would be native mixed broadleaf.
I would say it's plant, dig holes. You know, you could put the trees back in, and it will all, because those trees are going to make a relationship. So there's the mycorrhizal that connect with trees go around the roots like sheaths. They don't go in. So when you put those trees in, they're going to make a relationship with the soil microbiome. So I would say dig holes if they're trees, because you're thinking about the long term. You're planting a wood, and you actually want those roots to become established. You want those roots to make connections, so they're going to be making new connections. And it's when people say to me, when we're composting, which is again getting microbes in your garden, oh, well, I live in a town garden where you say to compost, but where are all the decomposers going to come from? They come. They just come. You know, people say, you can buy brandling worms on the internet. You don't need to buy brandling worms. They come. It's like the only place I would say they don't come, and this doesn't apply to you, but it's on a wider scale, and it's something we have to look at for policy, is all these new housing estates that have been put up. I had one person at a talk who said, I'm doing everything you've told me to do, but there's still no life in my garden. And I said, well, where are you living? In the middle of a new housing estate. And she was this oasis, and there was almost nothing for anything to connect to. So we have to make wildlife corridors. And I think in your case, dig, make trees, and they will all come. And well done for what you're doing. It's fantastic.
Thanks.
Can I just say on that lastly, that there's a gardener called Mary Reynolds. She was a gardener, and she's now more of a social activist for land. And she would say you could take some healthy soil from a woodland, and you can put it in water with an aerator to create like a microbial soup. So you could research microbial soups and compost teas. And even biodynamic gardening, in the spring, they do certain sprays, not sprays, they're making compost teas, and they're putting them on the land in micros. It's almost like a homeopathic, but they're adding the microbes onto the land and onto the soils. But I would just put a caveat and say, don't everyone go out and take loads of soil from places that you don't have permission to take them from. So you need to do it thoughtfully. But if you don't do it, they will come anyway.
I was interested in what had been done at the Knepp estate with the return of where they'd crushed the minerals and put that back in the soil. I'm wanting to take down a garage and take up the concrete. Are you saying that you would crush the concrete and return it to the soil?
Yeah, because concrete, actually, when I did research on what concrete is, it's predominantly limestone and clay. I did have a paragraph that I didn't read about how concrete is made. And it was to illustrate that concrete is limestone and clay. So this is what Karen Johnson's like. Did you go to her talk? It was just a couple of days ago. She's from Durham University, and she's really looking, doing research papers into re-putting, because a lot of our land has lost lost minerals because we haven't been treating them correctly. And this is where I am a bit like you. How would I crush my concrete? So if I'd gone back before I did my garden where you are now, how am I going to crush my concrete? I mean, this is because some of it was coming out in these massive pieces. So it's something that I want to explore. And I haven't done enough research myself to say, is there a certain quantity you have to put in? Could you just put it all in? But this is why it's quite exciting that this is quite new. I mean, NEP there put, did I say 400 tons on a small area? So they put a lot on. So I would say go and it's where I'm going to research more as well after doing this talk and going into concrete. Yeah, and I'd be really interested to hear where you go. But yeah. So I think it's fine to put it back in, but I don't know the quantity. But if it's got any of the other toxic materials in it, you know, if it's just concrete with that limestone and clay.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm just wondering about what you were saying about locality, and for example, with an oak tree, it's better maybe to have a seed from within 10 miles of where you're going to plant the new tree. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were saying that the main threat is a lot of plants that are coming in from nurseries in Holland and other places. The water in the nurseries and the soil in the nurseries can contain some microbes and diseases that then get spread all over the place. So I suppose it's interesting, this thing about getting seeds as close as possible to something that's been established locally for quite a while. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the perfect world, the best thing to do is to collect your own seeds. And even with trees, so last year I experimented with mulches, and I just I work in a lot of different properties, so I have access to a lot of green waste. And in one property, I took quite a lot of dumpy bags from a forest. So the trees were predominantly chestnut and oak, and I put that on my land. And why was I surprised in the spring when oak trees and chestnut trees began to grow? You know, so the best thing to do, and even when people say, well, where am I going to get trees from? If you've got time, grow your own trees. You know, if you can get seeds locally, it's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and the thing about bringing diseases in a healthy soil, you are going to have a microbial community who are there defending your plant. So they've seen with regenerative agriculture, you actually have something like 10 times less the problem with pests and diseases, because we have all these bacteria in the soil which are producing drugs that we will probably use. And I think it's Dave Goulson that, you know, talks about we're cutting down species in the Amazon, but what are their defensive, what are their antimicrobial, what are the properties? Plants are amazing. And healthy plants, when we leave them alone, when they can form all these relationships, these mutualistic and symbiotic relationships, they have their own armies defending us against disease and pests. I mean, I don't know specifically enough about pests that are brought in. I mean, I know ash dieback was brought in, you know, which is now decimating our ash population. So yes, it is a problem. So wherever possible. And we also know that seeds are actually, can I say seed is born? It's born with its own microbiome. They did experiments on oak trees and acorns, and they found that acorn is given microbes from the parent to help it grow, to help it germinate, for it to be strong. So if you can plant your own seeds and collect your own seeds from your local area, that is the best way, but sometimes that's not always possible. So try and go to someone you trust, you feel has got good practices, who's maybe sourcing their materials from this country and not abroad.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for about one more. Yeah, go ahead.
I work with farmers in Zambia, in the middle of Africa, and they use bokashi, fermented compost. And I was wondering if you use fermented compost, the bokashi, in your gardens, and if you recommend it.
I don't use bokashi. I've smelt bokashi, and it's very powerful smelling. I personally don't use it because you do have to get kind of right measurements. I have friends who use it, but no, I'm not a bokashi expert. As I said, I just put put it all together. My greens and my browns and my green Joanna are on New Zealand big style compost bins. So sorry, I don't use it. But it's a very and actually some people say bokashi isn't a composting process; it's a fermentation process. And then it's this liquid that you get, which you then dilute down, which is full of nutrients and has a fantastic smell to it as well.
Great. Well, before we finish up, I'd just like to thank you all for your amazing questions. They're much appreciated. We have a full program of events running today and tomorrow for the Science Festival, so please take a look at the program and come along if you can to any of our other events running. And take a look as well on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and we have a YouTube channel. And LinkedIn. So there's so many ways to follow along with what's going on with the Science Festival throughout the year. You may have noticed the feedback forms on your chairs. If you could take a moment to fill them in, that would be much appreciated. It's really helpful to us. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to Elizabeth for such a hopeful talk. Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.